Mr. Medish, thank you so much for your time, first of all, and I'm so glad to have you on our program. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Let's start from the very interesting topic, which could be the US-Chinese relations for today, for contemporary world. This is probably the major topic for the international relations. What do you think about the new administration of Mr. Biden, President Biden? We know that this is kind of still the new administration, just 100 days has passed nearly 1 week ago. So what could be the approach of Mr. Biden towards China?
Well, George, thank you again for having me. Pleasure to be on the program. I think you're asking the right question. I agree with your premise that the main challenge, foreign policy challenge for the U.S. Really is China, and China. And the Biden administration is acutely aware of this. They have stepped into power at a time of high tensions with China across a wide array of issues. Obviously, the Trump administration took a hard line on China in many respects, particularly on trade, as well as in some security areas, technology areas, and the like. And I think Biden and his team are trying to come up with a strategic approach. Everybody understands that we need to avoid a hot conflict. We should also try to avoid a new Cold War. But that means trying to reach some understandings about the rules of the road, as it were, for competition across an array of areas, as well as an understanding about red lines and conduct in the region and globally. There are some areas of potential cooperation that are promising, such as climate change. We've seen former Secretary of State John Kerry was just in China on this topic. But there are issues that are not well controlled at this moment, including possible flashpoint over Taiwan, the crackdown in Hong Kong, concern about human rights with the Uyghurs, and so on, as well as the continuing economic and technological rivalry. So as you said, early days, it's too early to give a clear opinion on the U.S. strategy, but there's no question this is the main priority in foreign policy. And I would add, it's a priority for domestic policy as well. Yeah. Because I think that President Biden and his team have understood that getting our own house in order in the U.S. in the near term and the longer term really is the building block for all foreign policy. It is a point about reestablishing U.S. credibility and to demonstrate U.S. resilience, because the U.S. does well when we lead by example. If our example is in doubt, it's a problem for not only domestically, but for U.S. foreign policy.
Mr. Medish, first, again, sorry, I would like to ask you again to move a little bit right from your side. And let's continue. So you mentioned the China, and this is clear that it's a main challenge for the U.S. foreign policy and even somehow for internal policy as well. And my question is how and why China became the main challenge for the United States?
Well, that's a great question, too. I mean, I think we have to look at a broader historical frame to answer that question, or begin to answer the question more fully. And that is that, after the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, the philosophy of globalization became the dominant framework for thinking and policy. And, it was in that context that a U.S. president, Bill Clinton, a Democrat, led a bipartisan kind of agreement. It wasn't a consensus, but it narrowly won to bring China into the WTO. Yeah. Right? To accord most favored nation status and so forth. That was really the big opening, 2001, 2002. We had the whole Goldman Sachs report on the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, right, as the new big emerging markets that would be integrated into the global system. So there was a real vision of growing interdependence, interaction, integration with China, maybe even convergence of political and economic systems in the long term. And that understanding really began to shatter about 10 years ago, gradually. And there was a transition of power in China, the rise of Xi Jinping, with a different vision and a different view of China's role in the world. A more assertive one, an idea that China could actually compete and win in this system, and that the Chinese model could be dominant. We had a reaction in the U.S., Trump's victory, a very hard line on China, a change in the bipartisan consensus on China in the U.S., that China had not been playing by the rules, had been cheating in the WTO, stealing intellectual property and so forth, and acting in bad faith. And therefore, we would have to take a harder line. So that's a big answer to your question. There's no single factor. It's a multifactorial dynamic model that explains how we moved from where we thought we were 20 years ago to where we are today, where we thought we were potential convergence, cooperation, to more of a standoff on an array of issues.
I see that the competing with China is something like must do for the United States. But on the other hand, how much the United States are ready for this competition, and what could be the cost of this competition for the United States?
I mean, I think it will require a concerted effort in the U.S. It will require some more strategic discipline than we have exhibited in recent years. But I think it's quite possible. I mean, I would say I would never bet against the U.S. in terms of resilience and the capacity to reinvent and to innovate. The U.S. is far from perfect. We have many challenges. Social, economic, our political system obviously has come under strain recently, but at the same time, no country has shown as much resilience as the U.S. And so that's why I'm actually quite optimistic about our ability to compete in the scenario that you outlined. But it will be a strong competition, and the Chinese have shown, you know, extreme strategic focus, mission-driven focus, particularly in the technological sphere. So this is a challenge, and I think there's also, we haven't discussed it yet, but enormous room for Western cooperation, U.S.-EU cooperation on China. I think there's a growing awareness in the EU today of the nature and the scope and the scale of the challenge coming from China.
What could be the result of this competition? I mean, in this question, I mean, from the perspective of Chinese perspective, it could not be something like the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, with the competition when the Soviet Union collapsed and a lot of independent countries rose in, and a lot of problems with that independent countries, with conflicts and stuff like that. Yeah? This can't be the same story with the China. And I mean, this can't be the understanding of the result of the competition, as I can see. But what could be the result of the competition from the Chinese perspective? What you are expecting?
Well, there are several scenarios. One scenario that is talked about is this idea of decoupling, that contrary to the vision of 20 years ago, let's say, rather than a convergence of systems and an agreement on shared rules and standards, we'll actually have a decoupling, a delinking of systems, right? Yeah. So that you would have a Chinese digital space and you'd have a Western digital space, with lots of walls of separation. So that's one question that's out there. I mean, both outcomes are possible. Some type of cooperation with mutually agreed rules, or a decoupling. Decoupling is probably a very suboptimal outcome for everybody. Yeah. So we're not there yet. But there is clearly right now, we're in the middle of a process of erecting walls and barriers in a context of mistrust about, again, from the Western side, stealing intellectual property, surveillance, privacy issues, right, with respect to data. And from the Chinese side, a concern that the convergence model really was one of a kind of political takeover, right? Kind of colored revolutions through digital technology. And that's what the Communist Party of China, led by Xi Jinping, is strongly resisting, and reasserting the control of the Communist Party and the role of the state in China's development. Yeah.
So you mentioned the last sentence was the state's role in the Chinese development. So on the contrary, we are thinking that on the Western side, from the Western side, the state's role was decreasing and decreasing in the decades. And finally, this was also one of the main reasons why China succeeds so far. So could we expect any kind of mind changing in the Western countries in this particular approach, for instance, when the President Trump was talking to bring back the production inside the United States and some writhing taxes about the Chinese production and stuff like that. I mean, the protectionism, so-called protectionism towards the domestic economics. Could it be somehow to change it because of this competition?
Yes, and I think we also have to add the context of the pandemic, which was a wake-up call to the world. But I think that both the China challenge and the pandemic don't lead to a single lesson, but rather many lessons. In other words, it's true that we are now in a period, I think, of growing awareness in the West that there is a role for the state. The idea of a pure libertarian free market approach, unregulated capitalism with no state supervision is just not realistic. Yes. Given the nature of domestic challenges and foreign threats, including climate change and disease. So it's going to be a question of balance points, however, because we certainly don't want a state system that chokes off private sector innovation, which has been a great engine in the US and also in Europe. It's a question of balancing. And I think what we're witnessing right now with the advent of the Biden administration is an attempt to rebalance. It's an attempt to rebalance the political economy in the US, and also to begin to articulate what does globalization 3.0 look like vis-a-vis the rest of the world.
On one hand, you mentioned that the U.S. policy is somehow, according to the Chinese competition, according to the competition with China, that U.S. is getting back side to side to Europe and its Western partners. What was the problematic with the Trump administration for several years? But my question is, what could be outcomes of this competition for the rest of the world? What could be the results of this competition for the other parts of the world? What could be what could our benefits or maybe losses for us who are living in outside these countries?
Right. No, it's a complex question. You know, I think that it's important to emphasize that President Trump really represented an aberration, an exception in U.S. policy, but particularly foreign policy. He was really the first openly isolationist president in modern times in the U.S. Yeah. The isolationist thesis had always been present in the debate in the U.S., but it had been a real minority position, you know, maybe 10, 15% on the spectrum. Yeah. And suddenly we had a president who represented a revisionism of the kind of bipartisan consensus, broad one on foreign policy since the end of the Second World War. The bipartisan consensus did not involve complete agreement on all issues, but it was a broad commitment to an outward U.S. role of forward engagement across many sectors across the globe. And Trump criticized that and said we couldn't afford it, and it had led to, you know, wars, the wars in the Middle East that had been so costly and unsuccessful. So it's just important to understand that political context, that there was a real debate in the U.S., and there still is, about isolationism versus engagement. But I think where we are right now with Biden is a recommitment to a higher degree of engagement and re-engagement. And for U.S. allies and partners around the world, that does mean that the U.S. is back, and that it's not a vacuum. Yeah. Because Trump threatened to create a vacuum in many regions that would open the world to more Chinese influence that was unchecked. And I mean, this goes across Asia, into Africa, into Europe, into Latin America. So the U.S. really is, I think, back and recommitted to that idea of forward engagement.
So, and the one question is about U.S. coming back to the global policy. So you mentioned that the Biden's administration is trying to show its recommitment and its readiness to come back to the global policy. But I have two questions. One is inside the United States, and what Trump was saying, as I believe, almost 70 million people supported in the last elections. Yeah. On the other hand, this is not the 1990 when the United States and the Western countries were alone on the global landscape. Then the Soviet Union collapsed. Now there are rising powers like China, like Russia as well, right? Like Turkey or Iran and stuff like that. I mean, a lot of huge countries are rising their powers along the globe. So how much United States are really committed to come back to the global politics?
Well, that's a great question. And I agree with your premise. We're in a more multipolar world in terms of economic power, military power, and influence. The U.S. still has, I would say, preponderant power and a history of leadership. Is it possible that we got too lazy while we were the only superpower? And maybe this is actually healthy, that the U.S. is now waking up to the challenge where we're going to have to work harder. We're going to have to work harder at diplomacy. We're going to have to invest more in ourselves and in our strategic partnerships and alliances. We can't put it on autopilot, as many people from both parties seem to assume in the U.S., in the triumphalism of the immediate post-Cold War period. You know, then another factor again was 9/11. That also put the U.S. on a new footing and ensnared us in long-term wars and military presence in the greater Middle East. We are rebalancing now against all of these factors. That's the challenge in front of Biden. I'm very encouraged, though, that President Biden seems to have an energy and a degree of insight that many people, including myself, were a bit doubtful of even during the presidential campaigns. He's not a young man. He didn't run the most dynamic campaign, but he started off this presidency with an impressive sense of focus and energy that is encouraging for me as an observer.
Yeah.
Now, let me add one more thing, that from the perspective of some of those countries you mentioned, China, Turkey, Russia, perhaps, they may be united in a sense, a theory that the U.S. is in permanent decline, that the high watermark of U.S. influence in the world is behind us. Many of those capitals and regimes seem to be operating under that assumption. And I think I understand why they reached that conclusion, but I think they're mistaken about it. And I think that they too will need to wake up and think about what makes the most strategic sense. And that is a recommitment to a degree of cooperation. So they need to be participants in globalization 3.0 as well.
Yeah,
it takes more than two to tango. It takes all of these great powers to dance together. Otherwise, it will end up in very bad and tragic results for our societies. And I think that in the end is what should discipline the leaderships. Everyone understands, particularly after the pandemic, or we're still in the middle of the pandemic, we must deliver prosperity and security and safety and basic needs to our citizens. Fighting wars and destructive competitions is not in anybody's interest. So we do have to hope for a restoration of reality, of rationality in global affairs.
Definitely.
We've had too much virus, too much politics, too much irrationality. We need a new equilibrium.
Definitely, we need, and we do. But what is the platform for this new equilibrium, and what is the platform from the new cooperation between the world powers?
Well, there isn't a single one. I think we do need to return to good faith multilateralism in many different fora. We took those for granted in the post-Cold War era. And an unhealthy unilateralism was seen in many capitals. Certainly in China and Russia, but also in the U.S. And Trump represented a unilateralism. So there has to first be a recommitment to the idea of multilateralism, diplomacy, and an attempt to forge rules and norms so that we can live together on the planet.
Yeah.
In a more complex environment. I mean, there's no question that technology, the digital age, is making this more challenging. It's creating all kinds of opportunities, but it's also making it more challenging because we've seen that cyber is not only a realm of information technology, but it's also a realm of potential warfare. So we need to reinvent multilateralism in an age of unprecedented digitalization, in an environment where climate change is an acute problem, and so is the threat of global pandemics.
Definitely. Mr. Medish, so I would like to switch to our region, because this is also for me the one of the place where the United States global interests are challenged. I mean, the Caucasus region, because the local regional powers, I mean, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, they are finding the they are meeting the same interest to withdraw the Western interests from the region and to strengthen their influence inside our region. What do you feel about the new administration of the United States regarding our region? How much this getting back to the global policy would affect on our region?
Well, I think there's no doubt that the Biden administration is committed to supporting the Caucasus region, other parts of Eurasia, former Soviet Union, and really wants to promote the prosperity and independence of all of those countries. That commitment is back. I think that unfortunately the Trump administration called some of those commitments into question, mostly rhetorically, but sometimes through actions. I think we're going to see a reversal, a recommitment on that under Biden. Again, it's in a different environment from 20 years ago or 30 years ago.
Definitely.
Right, and so again, it's a more multipolar situation. But I think the U.S. And Europe are very committed to upholding the sovereignty of all the countries in the region, and to promoting integration, particularly on the economic front, trade and investment. And of course, the countries themselves ultimately bear the responsibility for reforms. I mean, I think in Georgia, you're reaping the benefits of all the reforms that have taken place over several decades now. It wasn't a perfect path. It wasn't a linear path. But those reforms, market reforms, governance reforms, have built up the resilience. If a country is not resilient in and of itself, there's nothing that an outside friend can do. We have to all be very hard-headed and realistic about that. No degree of partnership or a Western alliance or the like can make up for a lack of domestic effort. And that goes for Georgia, for Ukraine, for countries of Central Asia and the like. But I think, fortunately, we've seen a lot of progress over the years.
So, Ms. Medish, could we say that this is a very interesting era we live in?
That would be an understatement. We're living in I think
there are a lot of game changers. Yes,
I think what a lot of game changers, a lot of challenges, a lot of volatility, and that is both a potential crisis but also an opportunity. We have a sense of tectonic plates shifting a bit, and we just have to make sure again that we have the resilience to withstand those pressures. A lot of work to be done, and a lot of burden on political leadership, on diplomacy, and on people-to-people exchanges. I mean, there's a role for civil society here. That's the other thing that technology has unleashed, and digital communications. There is no excuse in our day and age not to be able to communicate, collaborate, and try to find the truth together.
Yeah.
Now, at the same time, there are forces of darkness out there trying to propagate disinformation, fake news, conspiracy theories, and the like on a wide array, right? You know, that COVID was an invention of some dark force, and you shouldn't take the vaccines because people are putting chips in your skin or something like that.
Yeah, definitely.
Right.
Actually, my last question is about the pandemic. You started to talk somehow about that.
Yes.
What will be the outcome of pandemic for the international relations, for the global policy?
First of all, it's been an enormous test of anti-crisis economic programs everywhere. It's been a real-life stress test of healthcare systems everywhere. And I would expect that political reality will force countries to upgrade and reform their healthcare systems in response to this. We can't let it happen again. We can't allow ourselves to be as unprepared again, because the pandemic had been predicted. In fact, I was among those who warned a decade ago or more that a global pandemic was one of our biggest threats. And it wasn't because I had a great crystal ball. it was looking at SARS-1 and MERS from 15, 20 years ago, that it was clear that, these cross-border viruses posed a huge threat. But the next response needs to be multilateral again. We need to, not only do we need national resilience to be built up, but we also need global cooperation and multilateralism on biomedical research, vaccine preparedness, and the like. And so this should give a new energy not only to the WHO, which is an imperfect but necessary international body, but I'd like to see more forms of multilateral cooperation on healthcare and biomedical research. That should be a priority for the G7 and the G20, for example.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Good luck and healthy.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on your program, and thank you for the very sharp and on-point questions. I hope we can continue the dialogue.
Thank you so much.
And I wish the people of Georgia every success.